This video is the first of 2 videos on how to interview well, with a focus on entry-level academic faculty jobs. The first video will focus on context and structure of a typical set of interviews, while the second video will focus more on the interviews themselves, as well as general concepts. There are many entryways into academia, but going on the job market and doing faculty interviews is one common process that many go through. This series of videos is all about that process. While the video series uses the entry-level faculty job as an example, many of the tips will apply to many other types of interviews you may do during your career. The broad principle to remember for all types of interviews is that you want to pitch a compelling case for yourself, but you also want to be authentic and representative of what you bring to the table. If you overpitch and somehow manage to get hired under partially false pretenses, it will come back to bite you. The whole idea is to get hired, or perhaps in some cases not hired, based on an accurate portrayal of what you bring to the table. The first component of interviewing well is understanding the context in which your interview takes place. So what does being at the interview stage mean in the first place? Well, it means you've typically gone through what is usually a highly competitive process. You've done an initial application, you've possibly had some pre-interviews or discussions, and you're likely one of a relatively small number of candidates for the specific position or positions that are under consideration. Most commonly, an organization like a university is hiring for a specific position, but sometimes they hire in batches. And so the interview process isn't just about finding the right person in those situations, but also working out which person should go in which role. At the interview stage, you likely fall into one of 2 types of candidates which are being considered. Panels will typically look for both a relatively conventional fit to the position, but they will also sometimes consider what they will call wildcards. You need to be aware of which type of candidate they likely consider you to be. If you're what they refer to as a conventional candidate, you probably broadly fit the criteria for the position, and maybe there aren't really any red flags about your application. There may also not be any particularly so-called green flags, so you might just be a solid fit for the position. This means that you're in the running for the position, but it also means that during the interview process and surrounding activities, you really need to work to distinguish yourselves from the other conventional candidates. The second type of candidate, which is often considered for positions, is what we'd call the wildcard candidate. So selection panels will sometimes find a somewhat unorthodox candidate for a positioning particularly interesting and shortlist them with the idea to find out more in the interview process. A wildcard candidate typically has 2 or more key characteristics. There is some sort of hole or gap in what would be a conventional track record for this type of position, and they may also have some interesting but relatively unorthodox strengths. To get into the details of what a wildcard candidate might be in an academic faculty context, for a traditional academic teaching, research and service role, what most would call your typical all-round academic, a wildcard might be someone who has spent most of their time in industry and has relatively little teaching experience in a university context. It could also be someone who has primarily worked in one specific research discipline. Physics would be a common example of this, and has switched disciplines relatively recently and is rapidly building what is so far a relatively early stage track record in that new discipline. If you are a wildcard candidate, one of your primary missions is to convince the panel that any of these perceived gaps in your suitability for the role really aren't that big a concern, and that your strengths add substantial complementary capability to the group that you'd be joining. So following my previous example, someone who's been primarily in industry, who is perceived as having a lack of university teaching, might be able to point to industry-based courses that they've established and led as equivalent experience. Understanding the context of your hire is also about understanding what each organization you're talking to is looking for. And often every organization is looking for something slightly different. The more you can understand about the specifics of what they're hoping to gain by this hire, the better prepared you'll be for the interview. One of the most conventional types of role that an institution might be looking to fill is one that increases the critical mass of talent in an already established area at the university. For example, there may already be a machine learning group in the university, but perhaps they're lacking a computer vision specialist, so someone who specializes in a particular subset of this broad machine learning field. So they might be looking to hire someone with that specific skill set for the role. Another type of position might be all about establishing a new area of capacity. So the university organization might be looking for a candidate to establish and lead what is essentially a brand new research area or capability at the organization. A third type of role, which is even less constrained, sometimes referred to as a greenfields role, is one where there really aren't any particular constraints. They're just looking to hire fundamentally good and capable people who are going to contribute to the organization. Now you may be thinking, how do I find out all of this information, all of this background context to the role? Well, the good news is there are lots of people you can talk to. Often the role will involve some sort of recruiter or recruiting agency, and you can usually talk to them and find out more information. Just remember that they are primarily representing the organization who is making the hire, not you as an individual. They're interested in you as an individual because they think you might fit the role well. You can also talk to current professional and academic staff at the organization, like a university. Many will be quite willing to sit down and have a coffee chat with you or a virtual chat online, and you can find out more that way. Finally, you can talk to past employees of the organization, and you may even want to talk to people who've left the organization both on good terms and perhaps any who've left it on not so good terms. That will give you an accurate portrayal and representative account of what it is like to work at the organization and what they might be looking for in the role. Once you've understood the general context and background to the role, it's time to think about the actual structure of the interview process itself. Most interview processes for an entry-level or junior faculty role will have some or all of the following components. There'll be a panel interview with the hiring panel. You'll probably have to give a research talk, talking about your research, obviously, a teaching talk, perhaps a simulated lecture to students, and you may have one-on-one meetings with certain individuals, as well as small group meetings with people ranging from senior executive like deans all the way down to undergraduate students. And finally, you'll probably tour the organization itself. Some of these processes may already have started at the point at which you're engaging in the interviews. In today's world, it's important to note that the order and attendance of people from the organization at each of these events and interactions can be rather chaotic and unpredictable. So not everyone will attend every one of your talks and interviews, and these will often, unfortunately, be out of order just from simple logistical constraints. A common example of this, which can be frustrating, is you might do the interviews before you do the research talks and lectures, which can be a little frustrating because they haven't seen what you have to offer already. One consequence of this is that you should practice and be prepared to concisely and rapidly fill in people on the details of what you were talking about or are about to talk about, so that they get some context if they haven't seen your more detailed talks. Doing this well and concisely is an art of itself, and by doing it well, you can add to your appeal as a candidate. Another broad overarching principle of interviewing well for a faculty job is that you need to combine vision and aspiration with conveying your general level of effectiveness. Modern academia most definitely needs inspiring individuals with big picture visions, but at the same time, in an increasingly corporatized and busy academic environment, they need academics who are very effective at the core business of being an academic. Through all of your interactions, both the formal ones and your casual conversations, you really want to convey the fact that you have both of these characteristics and lots of them. For the research talk, the basics really apply here. You want to show that you have a deep understanding of the theory and technical aspects of your research discipline, as well as the greater context in which this research occurs, why it's important, and how it is or can be useful eventually for society. Compared to a typical research talk you might give when visiting a lab or at a conference, these research talks should typically be a little bit more forward-looking rather than an account of just what you've done. The university is typically making a very long-term financial bet on you, so you can lay out an exciting and relatively grand vision for what your research career and research group will do going forward, and make sure that you also present enough evidence and detail to show that it's feasible that you can pull off this vision. Many of the principles of the research talk also apply to the teaching talk. Again, you want to combine some grand vision as to new ways to do effective teaching, but you also want to convey that you are an effective and efficient teacher as well. You might choose to present some or all of a lecture that you already give, and in doing so, make sure you highlight some of the, pedagogical or didactic concerns. So what are the key learning outcomes for the material you're presenting? Give some context as to where this individual lecture would fit into a larger subject or course. Before the interviews, you should also do some research on the organization, the department, the school, the faculty that you will be working in. A compelling applicant will be able to talk in some detail about some of the potential collaborations they'd be able to establish were they to get the role. You'd also need to talk about some of the courses or units or subjects that would particularly appeal to you and would match to your existing teaching skill set. In doing so, you might name specific individuals already at the organization, as well as internal centers or groups, and talk about why the collaboration particularly makes sense. Never just collaboration for the sake of it. Before going into the interview, you should also appreciate that the interview itself is an opportunity for you to find out more about the role and the organization. You'll of course have done some background research, but during the interview itself you can ask the panel for more information about the role, the expectations of the role, and so on. This concludes part 1 of the video, which is really about the context in which an interview for a faculty job or any job takes place. In part 2 of the video, I'll talk through the actual interviews themselves in much more detail and cover some broader considerations and concepts to improve your ability to go through the overall interview process.